What happens when an army marches 200 miles through enemy land under a burning sun that kills as surely as bullets? What do soldiers fear more, the enemy ahead or the disease that hunts them from behind? And when victory demands not just courage, but the breaking of body and soul, who survives the march and who becomes part of the road itself? This is the story of that march. From the shores of Veracruz to the gates of Puebla, the road that would bleed both armies dry. The Gulf was calm that morning, unnaturally calm. The sky glowed like molten copper over the horizon, and out of that glare came ships. Dozens of them, their sails stretched tight, their decks packed with men in blue uniforms. From afar, they looked like a swarm of insects crawling toward the shore. It was March 1847. The United States Army had arrived to invade Mexico. They said it would be quick, a few battles, a treaty, and glory. They were wrong. Inside those ships, thousands of soldiers waited in silence. The smell of salt, sweat, and fear mixed with gun oil. Officers whispered orders, drums beat once, then again, and boats were lowered into the waves. The invasion had begun. The men of General Winfield Scott's army rode toward the beaches of Veracruz, bracing for hell. Mexican guns lined the ramparts, black flags flew from the walls. The defenders waited. The Americans hit the beach in silence. Not a single shot greeted them. No one knew why. For a moment, the invaders thought the city had surrendered, until the first cannon thundered. A flash, a roar, and the beach erupted. Sand burst into the air, men screamed, and the calm of dawn was shattered by war. From behind dunes and fortress caissons, Mexican artillery poured fire into the landing zone. Shells exploded in the surf, tossing soldiers into the water. But the Americans kept coming, forming lines, planting flags, dragging cannons ashore. By nightfall, a beachhead had been taken, but victory came at a cost. Hundreds lay dead or burned, and the air reeked of salt and blood. The siege of Veracruz had begun. For 20 days, cannon thunder shook the earth. The city, once called the gateway to Mexico, became a tomb of dust and fire. American mortars howled over the walls, smashing churches, homes, and barracks alike. Women and children huddled in basements, praying as the walls shook above them. Scott demanded surrender. The Mexican commander refused. But the shells did not. On March 27th, after days of bombardment, Veracruz fell. The city surrendered. When the gates opened, the streets were lined with corpses and rubble. It was the first American victory on Mexican soil, but also a warning. Because Veracruz wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a march that would make even the victors question what they were fighting for. The next objective, Puebla, a city 200 miles inland, through swamps, jungles, and mountains crawling with guerrillas. Scott's army, 8,500 strong, began the march west. They carried heavy packs under a sun that melted the road into mud. Each man's uniform was soaked in sweat, boots split open, shoulders blistered. The mosquitoes came first, then the fever. Within days, cholera and dysentery spread through the ranks. Men collapsed mid-march, their canteens empty, their lips cracked open. The heat was so intense that officers said you could smell the rot of death before seeing the bodies. At night, rain poured in sheets, tents flooded, mules sank into mud pits and never came out. But Scott kept moving, always forward. Behind them, small detachments of Mexican horsemen watched, waiting. They struck at supply wagons, ambushed stragglers, cut throats in the dark. The Americans called them bandits, Mexico called them patriots. The march was not just physical, it was psychological. Soldiers wrote in their journals about the silence between attacks, how the jungle seemed alive, watching. They said the worst sound was the cry of "Viva Mexico!" echoing out of nowhere before the first volley hit. But for every ambush, the Americans answered with fire. Villages were burned, bridges destroyed, and prisoners shot. The march grew redder with every mile. By the time they reached the highlands near Jalapa, the army was half dead from disease. But ahead waited one of Mexico's most experienced generals, Antonio López de Santa Anna. He had gathered nearly 12,000 men and placed them on the heights of Cerro Gordo, a natural fortress of cliffs and ravines. It was supposed to be impenetrable. But Scott saw something Santa Anna didn't. A narrow mountain path to the left, hidden by jungle. He sent his engineers and General Twiggs' division to flank it. They climbed for hours, silent, dragging cannons by hand up the rocks. At dawn on April 18th, they struck. The sound shattered the valley. Musket volleys, cannon fire, the echo of bugles bouncing off stone. American troops stormed the heights. Mexican soldiers fought back fiercely, hand to hand, bayonet to bayonet, but the flank had worked. The defenders were surrounded. The battle was over in 3 hours. Santa Anna fled, leaving behind his carriage, gold, and even his wooden leg, captured as a trophy. Cerro Gordo was a triumph for Scott, but again, a bloody one. Hundreds lay dead across the hillsides, and the path forward was littered with their bodies. The march continued. If you're still here, you're part of the few who truly live for history. Stay with me, and make sure you're subscribed. The road ahead only gets darker. Past Jalapa, the terrain rose into mountains. The air thinned. The nights turned cold. Every mile meant another burial. Officers stopped counting the dead. The supply lines stretched thin, and the locals offered nothing but hostility. American foragers were killed in villages, wells were poisoned, and the army began running out of food. Yet somehow, the discipline held. Because ahead lay Puebla, the second largest city in Mexico, and the last obstacle before Mexico City itself. When the army reached its outskirts in early May, they expected another fortress like Veracruz. But Puebla did not fight. Its leaders, seeing the destruction of Veracruz and Cerro Gordo, chose to surrender without a shot. For Scott's men, it was salvation. They entered the city exhausted, starving, and half-mad with disease. The churches became hospitals, the plazas turned into camps, and the people of Puebla watched silently from behind shutters as the invaders moved in. For weeks, the Americans rested there. They buried the sick, cleaned their wounds, and wrote letters home. But peace was an illusion. Guerrilla bands still roamed the countryside, roads were cut off, and even as they prepared to march on Mexico City, Scott knew the worst was yet to come. The men who had survived Veracruz, the fever, and the mountains would soon walk into one of the bloodiest chapters of the war. But Puebla was the moment when they realized something crucial. They weren't just fighting Mexico anymore. They were fighting the land itself. The jungle, the heat, the sickness of it had become an enemy that never slept, never surrendered. Months later, veterans of the campaign would speak of Veracruz and Cerro Gordo with pride. But when they spoke of the march, of the days between battles, their voices would drop. They remembered the stench of rotting mules, the faces of comrades half buried in mud, and the endless horizon of dust that led nowhere. Some said the war was won at Mexico City. Others said it was won on that road, paid for by every nameless soldier who never reached the end. Because sometimes history remembers the victories, but it's the march that defines the price. And in 1847, on the road from Veracruz to Puebla, that price was blood. The cannons would roar again soon, but for those who survived the march, the real war had already ended. Inside them,